Welcome to Real Time Review. I'm your host, Jesse Nussman. With me, as always, fellow Atlanta film critic Jason Evans. And Jason, judging by that demonic object that you have hanging underneath your foot.
Should I bring in our guest? It's Jesse, Jason, and our guest star today. Yes.
So I guess you've brought this sort of creepy, unsettling DVD case, whatever this is,
yes,
out. Because we are talking about Planet of the Apes today, specifically Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, which now appears to be the biggest movie around the world. People are going ape for the apes.
Oh, you're so clever.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the concept of evolution?
I'm going to put him aside for a minute.
Yeah. Why don't you get that really terrible thing out of here. But first, I think we should talk about, like, what is your relationship to the Planet of the Apes series? Is this like a franchise that you have like a deep attachment to? What's kind of your... have you been following it since 1968 when the original came out?
I mean, I'm not quite that old, but I do recall watching...
What?
Yeah, right. I know I'm ancient, but not quite that old. I do recall watching the originals, not in theaters, again, not quite old enough, but on television, on cable and the such. A couple of them are really, really great. You know, I'm talking about like the original. I think there are maybe five or six movies.
Yeah, I remember seeing them as kids, and like, I don't know what your experience was when you saw the first one for the first time, but I was probably about like 10, and I just remember like you get to that infamous twist ending at the end of the first Planet of the Apes where you realize Charlton Heston has been on Earth the entire
time. Yeah,
and I just remember that.
Spoiler alert!
Spoiler alert to a movie that's over 50 years old.
Exactly.
But yeah, I just remember that moment kind of blowing my mind as a 10-year-old, and for all the kind of ups and downs that the series has taken throughout the years and various iterations, from kind of the 5 original movies you're talking about to a TV series to a awful Tim Burton remake we won't talk about, to now these more recent movies that incorporate all of this high-tech motion capture performance stuff. I think this series is always interesting, even when it's bad, and is always sort of grasping for kind of these larger ideas about kind of like politics and religion and about mankind's own capacity for destruction against ourselves and against nature. I'm curious, how well did you feel this kind of newest entry fit into kind of like the larger mythology of this whole franchise? Yeah,
so I should start by saying that though I have that relationship with the earlier movies, the most recent 3 films, the trilogy that came out, Matt Reeves was behind them for the most part, in the past decade or so, I think are outstanding films. Some of the best sci-fi, and in fact, arguably the best sci-fi series that we've gotten over the past decade or so. So I was very, very excited for this latest film. It is still hand in hand with those in terms of unbelievable world building.
Oh yeah.
The scenery, the world that you're immersed in is amazing. And one of the things that strikes me about this movie is that there are no stars in it. Literally no.
No, I was talking this morning about how, like, as much as I kind of liked the movie, there was like a surreal aspect of walking out being like, we really did just sit through 2.5 hours of like, ape, love ape.
Yeah.
Want to hold ape.
Well,
ape, go here.
Well, but the thing I was going to say was there are no stars in it. And the movie cost $165 million to make. And my bet is $163 million of it is on that screen. That they did not pay for a big name. They didn't even pay really for a big name director. This is a movie where they invested in the visual experience. And I think one of the reasons it's connecting with audiences is because of an incredible visual. The movie starts...
It is up there with kind of like Avatar in terms of the sort of weird sort of place your brain goes where you're like, I know that everything I'm seeing on screen is ones and zeros, is all CG and doesn't exist,
but it still looks so real,
tactile and so real, and like these motion capture performances that the actors playing the apes are giving are so nuanced and expressive. Like I just kept having to pinch myself over and over again of like, I can't believe what I'm looking at is not real.
Right. Well,
it doesn't exist.
When you think about the original films, where Roddy McDowall and the other folks who were inside those ape costumes could barely move, their faces don't move at all. And here we have apes where they have very distinct personalities. They're very expressive and emotive. And I was going to say, like, the opening scene is a trio of young apes climbing up what looks like a tree or a cliff, and we eventually learn eventually, like in the next 30 seconds or so,
Right.
we learn that it is a skyscraper from a a human city that has been grown over by plants and brush and stuff like that. It's amazing to look at, and that to me is what makes this film great. That said, it is sorely lacking in story. It is a movie that I think mostly exists to set up a new trilogy. Like everything about this film is,
That's probably
let's
fair.
get us ready for what's going to come next.
It also feels like the series is sort of catching up with kind of like the original movies, and there are sort of more callbacks and more kind of recreations of iconography that we would have seen in like the 1968 film. I probably agree with you that I think, as much as I was blown away by kind of the visual splendor of it all and about the world building and the effects and just sort of the achievement of what you were seeing on screen.
Yeah, and it is.
I do think the one thing that kind of keeps me from kind of really getting behind this movie and really like loving it and saying it's great is I do kind of wish that this series would kind of go for the sort of like big provocative swings that it used to kind of back in the 70s.
Yeah,
all of those,
there's some safety involved in this one.
all of those movies, end in these very provocative, very challenging ways that are basically just sort of like you got to shake the audience and then sort of like throw them out of the theater. And
well, I feel like the past few have come close to that at least.
a little bit but again, it just sort of becomes this thing where it's like if a studio like Fox, which I guess is owned by Disney now, is going to dump several $100 million into this thing, like
they want to be
can't
safe.
make as provocative or challenging or quote upsetting
That's a pity,
storytelling decisions. So I would say I recommend it for people if you haven't seen it. It is a thing to behold, what you are seeing on screen. But maybe I kind of wish if we're going to continue with this series, I kind of wish it could get a little bit unafraid to sort of like leave people upset leaving the theater. And that sounds like a weird thing to say of like I want people to be upset, but like I kind of wish that for as wild and crazy as this series used to be back in its heyday, that like it would maybe sort of like roll up its sleeves a little bit and not be afraid to just like swing for the rafters and do something that's really going to like leave people's jaw on the floor, for better or for worse.
Yeah. So two things I would say about it. The first one is I feel like I couldn't decide who I was rooting for, the apes or the humans. There are not a lot of humans in it, and there are of course some bad guy apes that you're absolutely not rooting for. But there's a human who teams up with the apes, and toward the end of this movie, I was like, I'm not sure which one I'm on the side of.
Right.
Which I think is something that the original series, the original movies back in the 60s and 70s did a really nice job of. Humans are the good guys, but over the course of those movies, humans become the bad guys and the apes become the good guys. And I think it's very interesting that this film is beginning to pursue that. And I'm somewhat eager to see where it goes next.
Yeah.
Because I think that they could be taking us in an interesting direction. We are obviously biased toward humans.
Right. And I mean, there is an interesting thing that this movie, kind of its most interesting idea is sort of taking the sort of story of those sort of last three movies that you mentioned that had Andy Serkis in it and that Matt Reeves was involved in, and sort of plunging us several hundred years in the future and sort of
that becomes legend.
Posing the question of like, well, what happens if someone takes these sort of lessons and philosophy of those movies but then twists it into something evil, and then now all of a sudden the villains are the ones that are sort of professing the sort of like philosophical ideas that you saw in those first three movies. I don't know that
it doesn't really get there.
It doesn't totally sink into it as much as you would want, but that's kind of like the most interesting, I think, nugget of an idea that they have to kind of play with in this movie.
Yeah, I feel like they didn't ever really get us to what the major plot, what the major moral and emotional questions of the there will be sequels of the sequels will be. But the other point that I was going to make about this, and this is something I almost never say, I don't think this is a film where you wait for it on streaming. I think that the story is sort of thin enough that if you were sitting at home, unless you have a truly incredible projection system, if you're sitting at home, you can be like, eh. Whereas if you're in a theater and you're immersed in this film and you're really seeing the impressive scope and the impressive $165 million budget right there in front of you, that's when you can really appreciate this film. So if you're someone who's sort of like on the fence, should I wait for it on streaming? I think you can almost go, pass. But if you're someone who thinks this would be really cool, go see it in a theater, because that is where this film is made to be seen. It is not made to be seen at home.
Well, speaking of spectacle and science fiction, next week we are going to be discussing Furiosa, our return to the Mad Max universe with George Miller. Greatly look forward to that conversation, but until that comes, we'll see you all at the movies.